Hi everyone, I'm Ava and today I wanted to talk to you about Amsterdam versus Utrecht. As some of you might know, I live in Utrecht and I have been living here for the past several months. But when I first moved to the Netherlands, I actually moved to Amsterdam. And in the 4 years leading up to my move, when I was still dating my Dutch girlfriend, we would actually take trips to Amsterdam and we spent whole summers there together. So I feel like I've gotten to know both cities pretty well. And in this video, I wanted to highlight some of the differences between Amsterdam and Utrecht, well, just because it's fun. So let's get into it. The first thing that I wanted to talk about is the international community. There are international communities both in Amsterdam and Utrecht, but there is one difference that I've noticed, and maybe that's just me and my experience, but the one thing that I've noticed in the international community in Amsterdam is that people would come, live in Amsterdam as an expat, and then after a couple of years, they would go back to their country or move somewhere else. Whereas here in Utrecht, I get the sense that people are here to stay. Even expats who have moved recently tell me things like they really want to make this their permanent home. So if this is true, why do you think that is? I tried to think about this and the only thing I could come up with is that there are more businesses centered in Amsterdam, so people would maybe move to take a job and then they would move if their job required them to move. Whereas in Utrecht, they are jobs, of course, it is a big city, but at the same time, maybe not as many. So that was the first difference that I noticed, that the international community in Amsterdam consisted of people who would come, move in, and move out, whereas here in Utrecht, I get the sense that it's pretty stable. The second thing I want to talk about is kind of along the same lines, but that is that to me, Utrecht feels more Dutch. Now, I don't mean that the buildings and the architecture of Utrecht is more Dutch than that in Amsterdam, but the sense that I get is if I walk around in Utrecht, even in the city center, I am going to hear more Dutch spoken on the streets. Whereas when I'm in Amsterdam, I often hear English. And of course, being an English speaker, my ears perk up when I hear people speaking English. And I've also heard many other languages being spoken in Amsterdam. I'm not saying that's not the case in Utrecht, but I'm saying that it's more the case that you will hear Dutch spoken around you if you are here. Whereas in Amsterdam, you're more likely to not hear Dutch in the center. I guess that's very telling. So this is what I mean by I get the sense that Utrecht is more Dutch than Amsterdam. The other way in which I get that feeling is when I walk into a cafe in Amsterdam, I have to be extremely self-conscious. I have to make sure that I don't slip up, not one bit, in my actions or in my speech. Because I feel like if I make a mistake in my Dutch, or if I'm standing maybe on the wrong side of the cafe, they will not be speaking to me in Dutch. Oh no. They will start speaking to me in English. They don't even need to hear me speak. I don't even get to show them how bad my Dutch accent is. They will just take one look at me and go, not Dutch. And they will speak to me in English. Here in Utrecht, that's really not the case. I was quite surprised in the beginning when I would go to cafes, and even if I behaved like a total idiot, did things that no Dutch people would ever do, they would still speak to me in Dutch. So I had to improve my Dutch very, very quickly to get past the point where I could just say things like, can I please have X, Y, and Z to, getting to the intricacies of the menu, because people were just more likely to stick to Dutch here. And I love it because I feel like I'm more integrated and more connected to the city and the Dutch culture. And I don't have to feel like an outsider all the time. I feel like, well, people are appreciating me for trying because at least they respond to me in Dutch. So that is another difference between Utrecht and Amsterdam. If you are an expat and watching this, have you had that experience too? Let me know. Number 3 is the vibe in Utrecht and Amsterdam. Now, while both of these cities are absolutely gorgeous, I mean, oh my God, the canals in Utrecht and Amsterdam, so beautiful. And every time I make a video, I feel like I need to express my love for these canals and these beautiful cities. Needless to say, it was one of the reasons why I moved here. But even though both of these cities are extremely beautiful and both Utrecht and Amsterdam have a lot to do in them. Yes, international people watching this, you have a lot of things to do in Utrecht. You could never get bored here. But there is a difference between the vibe in the two cities. And that is, of course, because Amsterdam is just bigger. You walk around in the streets and you'll see taller buildings. You'll see more people. Except if you're in the center of Utrecht, then you'll see a lot of people too. I was surprised to find that Utrecht city center can get as crowded as Dam Square in Amsterdam sometimes. I am not kidding. People like to come to the center of Utrecht and shop. The other thing you'll notice when you walk around Utrecht along the canals, you'll see that there are these cellars at the bottom. When you're in Utrecht, you aren't just limited to walking on top of the canals, but you can actually go and be at the level of the water. And some of these restaurants and cafes are actually in these cellars. Some of these cellars, I think, are also just homes. And it's really cool to be able to be at that level and enjoy the beautiful canals. But the main difference I wanted to talk about, of course, is that Amsterdam really has a big city vibe. And one of the reasons for that, I believe, is the public transport. Here in Utrecht, we don't have trams, we have buses, and taking buses are really not that common. In Amsterdam, on the other hand, buses, trams, and the metro are just everywhere. Especially since the metro was created for the North-South line, you could really get from one point to another very, very quickly. I just took the metro here and I literally went from Amstel to Weesperplein in less than 2 minutes. Like literally, including transfer and everything. So because of the metro and the trams, you can really get around really easily in Amsterdam. And of course you have your bikes, but I think the public transport gives it that big city feel. Now I know the Dutch people like to bike everywhere, and absolutely, people bike everywhere in Amsterdam too. But let me tell you, when I was commuting to work, when it rained, those trams were full. So I know that I am not the only one in Amsterdam who made use of that public transportation. And of course, I guess taking the bus isn't very common in Utrecht because you can literally bike anywhere in 10 minutes. No, that is not an exaggeration. The next thing I want to talk to you guys about, and no one will be surprised by this, is that Utrecht is cheaper. If I were filming this from Amsterdam, I would be filming to you from a cardboard box on the street. That cardboard box might have been alongside a canal, but in Utrecht, you get a bigger bang for your buck. Now, while I haven't really noticed too much of a difference when you go to restaurants, that varies by restaurant, or when you go to a cafe, it'll vary by cafe, and groceries and buying stuff like that seems pretty much the same in the two cities. However, you know I'm going to talk about this. Renting or buying a place in Amsterdam is just so expensive. Here in Utrecht, for the same prices you would get an apartment in Amsterdam, you could get a small house. Well, first of all, there are small houses in Utrecht, and in Amsterdam, there just aren't any. So if you are someone who would like to live in a house, it might be really difficult to do in Amsterdam because you can't live in something that doesn't exist. Before I move on with the list, I wanted to take a moment and say I know there are still very many of you who watch my videos and have not subscribed yet. Please hit that button. The next difference between Utrecht and Amsterdam that I wanted to talk about is how much more easily accessible the other parts of the Netherlands are from Utrecht. Now, the Netherlands is quite small, so from Amsterdam you could really easily get to the other parts of the Netherlands. But Utrecht is really in the center of the country. I mean, the train station is so busy, and that is because everyone goes through Utrecht if you're trying to get from one point of the country to the other. This is initially what drew me to Utrecht because I actually wasn't sure in the beginning where I would be working, and I felt like being in Utrecht was a safe bet. And recently I'm actually trying to visit more of the country, and I am really grateful for how easy it is to get from Utrecht to other places. Just to give an example, I was surprised how I can go from Utrecht to The Hague in 40 minutes, but if I were to go from Amsterdam, it would take over an hour. So that is just an example of what that difference looks like. It's not a lot, but if you are someone who does this pretty frequently, you will start to notice. Moving on to the next item on the list, and that is that Amsterdam is basically the cultural hub of the country. And what that translates to is that there is just a lot more going on in Amsterdam. There are a lot more museums, a lot more shows, and in Utrecht that is a little bit less. So Utrecht does have some museums, for instance, the famous Nijntje Museum, there's the Utrecht Centraal Museum, and there's also a Museum of Religious Art. There are a couple of others too, but these are the top ones that come to mind. Whereas in Amsterdam, I couldn't even begin listing them because there might be a couple of the famous ones the tourists go to, but there are a ton of museums in Amsterdam to choose from. And the other thing is, of course, the theaters, the shows. If you're gonna talk about the literary cultural scene, it is just way bigger in Amsterdam. If this is something that's extremely important to you and you wanna be right in the center and the hub of it, then naturally Amsterdam is the place to be, as long as you can afford it. And the last thing I wanted to talk about on this list is something that I personally find that people underestimate about Utrecht. Underestimate. Is the word underestimate right there? One of the things that I think is underrated in Utrecht, that's the word I'm looking for, underrated. Okay, one of the things that is underrated in Utrecht is how easy it is to access outdoor/naturey things from here. Because the populous parts of Utrecht are quite small, within a 30-minute biking radius from the city center, you could find yourself at several castles and several outdoor ponds. So especially during COVID-19 and the summer, I was really lucky to be able to take advantage of that. I went to a lot of castles, more castles than I've seen in my entire life leading up to this point, all in one summer. And it was also pretty hot at times, and I was lucky enough to be able to go to the plaza, as we call it, or some boulders, outdoors in nature in Utrecht. And these places are extremely beautiful. And it's not just one or two, but there's several options to choose from. So I actually think this is one of the things that's underrated here, because if you live in a big city like Amsterdam, like I've done in my whole life up to this point, you could bike for 30 minutes, sure, and you'll just find yourself in a different part of the city. And that is the case in Amsterdam. If you bike for 30 minutes in Amsterdam, you will most likely find yourself in another part of Amsterdam, which is great, but it's just different from what you can get in Utrecht. If you are someone who likes the outdoors and prefers to get out of the city once in a while, this is great for you. So this is something that I definitely wanted to mention, because as I said, it is underrated, not underestimated. I don't know why I said that. And I swear, English is my first language. So those are some of the differences that I've noticed between Amsterdam and Utrecht, and I wanted to share that with you today. If there are any more differences that I missed out, left out in this list, please let me know in the comments as usual.